Welcome to the Heart Lab podcast presented by the Victor Chang Institute, St Vincent's Institute and St Vincent's Hospital. My name's Alex Clements. I'm here with André Gerche. Welcome, André.
G'day, Alex. Good to be here.
Today we're going to talk about sudden cardiac death. We're eventually going to get to sudden cardiac death. And we're going to go through the range of definitions, treatments, preventions, what we know, what we don't know, and what you and your team are looking at, researching, and thinking about at the Heart Lab.
Yes. And the whole discussion has been prompted by the tragic death of Edward Millier, which happened in Melbourne, Australia, a high school rower who died suddenly whilst doing rowing training, and shocked the local community. Will have changed his family forever. It's a devastating situation. It occurs all too often. It made the headlines, and when these things happen, it's almost presented like someone's been struck by lightning. But as we'll discuss, it happens much more commonly than people realise, and we need to do something about it. We need to understand it, and we need to find some preventive strategies.
Headline stat to start off.
Headline stat would be 500 Victorians under the age of 50 die of sudden cardiac death every year. So nearly 2 people every single day in Victoria. Population of 5.5 million people under the age of 50. I think people get another headline stat that's 3 to 4 times more than the equivalent age group dying in car accidents. You've seen the ads, Greg the stop sign. We've got all these strategies. Airbags, belts, they've all helped. But here's something that occurs 4 times more often. People wouldn't have a clue.
And relative to other cancers, illnesses, suicides?
So under the age of 50, it's in the top couple of reasons why you would die. The thing that it competes with that's not the right term, is it? But on those charts, suicide and sudden cardiac death. Suicide's difficult because for various reasons the statistics are not easy to come by, but it's probably the number one thing in young people, and then followed by sudden cardiac death in both men and women. So again, people will be surprised that in men it exceeds all cancer causes put together, and in women it also exceeds cancer as the most likely cause of dying under the age of 50. So it's a headline event, but it's people are constantly surprised when they're told those statistics, but they're rock solid, and we can speak to them very accurately in Victoria because we run a database that registers every single cardiac arrest in someone under the age of 50 that occurs in Victoria. So we know exactly how many people are dying in Victoria of this cause. That
population under 50, what do you know about them?
Well,
are there any consistencies in that person that's suffering that sudden cardiac death?
Yes and no. So it's a complex group. We know that as you go through that age group, it becomes more common. So why are we talking about under 50? To some degree, you need to put some almost arbitrary time limit on it, because once we get into older age groups, there's less attention given to why people die, less autopsies, etc. So we can be more certain about people under the age of 50, but also because as we become older, the most likely cause of having a cardiac arrest becomes a heart attack. So you say, hang on, what heart attack? What's the difference? We refer to a heart attack when there's gunk in your heart vessels and that suddenly clots off. So when you see on the movies and things of people grabbing their chest, or all of the cholesterol, blood pressure, all of those strategies are to stop us building up cholesterol gunk in the arteries that can suddenly block off. And that is the number one cause across the whole lifespan of cardiovascular cause of dying. And as we go from age 1 through to 50, that becomes more and more common. But particularly under about the age of 30, the most common cause are a mix of genetic conditions. So things like, people might have heard cardiomyopathies, so that means a heart condition of the heart muscle. Channelopathies, meaning conditions that affect the little electrical channels within the heart. So all of these little silent conditions that you or I might have and not even know about them, but it could be sort of an underlying predisposition to the electric suddenly going mad and causing a cardiac arrest. So under the age of 50, one of the challenges is that there's a mix of about, of a dozen or more competing causes. There's some of those that are the headline things, like a heart attack or coronary vessel disease, particularly 30 to 50. Other things like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, one of those things where the heart muscle gets thick, which is one of the more common causes. There's a list of things, and we might discuss that a little bit more, but that's one of the main challenges when we're talking about cardiac arrest. We're not going to be able to find preventions and treatments until we really understand it. And things like the NUCD, the registry that we have in Victoria, we now have really good statistics of what those causes are, what's most likely. The other thing that that is actually really important is that if a 20-year-old has a cardiac arrest, about 45% of the time, when we then look into it, it's actually not due to a heart cause. So it can be a bleed around the brain, or it can be a clot going to the lungs, a number of causes that sort of we have ended up, because we used to think that when someone has a out of hospital arrest, that it's nearly always a heart cause. Now we know that it's still the majority, but there's a whole lot of other things that it could be. Of the heart causes, the 55%, then there's those conditions I mentioned: heart attack, cardiomyopathies, channelopathies. Some of those are genetic conditions, some other things. But there is a group of cases, and it's about 40% of cardiac arrests due to a cardiac cause, where we can't specifically put our finger on it. And it's called unexplained cardiac death or sudden arrhythmic death syndrome. People might have heard of SADS, sudden arrhythmic death syndrome. It's basically where we're really quite certain it was due to a cardiac arrhythmia, due to the heart rhythm suddenly going ballistic, but we can't find the cause. After doing an autopsy, the heart looks normal. If we then do tests on family members and do genetics, etc., we quite often then can find the cause, because it's due to one of these genetic conditions that causes an electrical problem. Problem is, an electrical problem where the heart goes haywire can occur without the heart looking different. So you can have a careful look at the heart, the most careful look possible, and still not find the cause until we later do genetics and family testing. So it's an incredibly specialised science through every level, through the cardiologist like myself looking at all the information we can, at family members, requesting genetic testing, etc. All of those things, a bit like a detective. Very important piece is the forensic pathologist who needs to be highly trained at looking at different patterns of the heart muscle and bits of injury, etc. It really is a bit the sort of Sherlock Holmes to try to come up with what the cause is, and it's critically important because in a reasonable proportion we will find a condition that runs through families. And there's lots of families out there right now where tragically it has been a person dying that has led to other family members being saved with the same condition.
Right. A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, a lot to unpack, and it's already probably confusing a lot of people.
So maybe to start, if you go back to, you talked a little bit a bit about the definitions, but heart attack, heart failure, cardiac arrest, sudden cardiac death. Maybe start with sudden cardiac death.
Yeah,
and
so
what that actually means, and obviously there's a bit of an inference in the name of it, but
Yep.
what's happening?
Well, it's a really good point, because it's very frustrating for someone like me to watch the television and Eriksson, the Danish footballer, has a cardiac arrest on the field, and you then watch the news and they say he had heart failure, he had a heart attack, he had a cardiac arrest. From a cardiologist's point of view, they're three completely different things, but it just shows again, and I think it speaks to how, despite this being happen all too often, we haven't even arrived at language that the media sort of can consistently use. So a cardiac arrest is when the heart goes into a very fast, chaotic heart rhythm, so that the heart isn't pumping properly. So the heart beats. It's one of the miracles of nature, is the heart beats, millions, trillions of times through a lifetime and never gets a beat wrong. But if it has something wrong with the heart muscle, the electrics, or if there's a blockage of the arteries to the heart, it can suddenly go boom, boom, and with that, it just doesn't pump in any meaningful way. No blood goes round to the organs, to the muscles, to the brain being particularly critical. And if you're not getting the blood flow and oxygen, then it's an absolute race of time to do something, which we'll get back to. So that's a cardiac arrest. The term sudden cardiac death refers to the unfortunate statistic that if people have a cardiac arrest, only 10% survive, meaning that of every cardiac arrest, 90% become sudden cardiac death. So that's a person who dies of having suffered a cardiac arrest, is then called sudden cardiac death. A heart attack, like we discussed before, should be applied specifically to the situation where there's a heart artery that's blocked. It's a common cause of cardiac arrest, but it's certainly not all causes. And then heart failure is almost a completely different term, and that's where the heart pump isn't working, and people have more troubles with breathlessness and various symptoms, accumulation of fluid, but is not a sort of sudden condition. Even though it sort of sounds like, yes, the heart fails, the term heart failure is different. It's a chronic, long-standing thing. So probably the main thing is for people to understand the term, that when someone is well 1 minute and then unconscious the next, then that is nearly always a cardiac arrest and should be treated as a cardiac arrest, i.e. the heart's gone into this sudden chaotic rhythm that causes no meaningful contraction of the heart.
So to use the Christian Eriksen case, Danish footballer, he had a cardiac arrest.
He had a cardiac arrest, was fortunate enough for, in some ways the benefit of it happening on a football field is that it's one of the places where it's very well planned for, have very good resuscitation. He had immediate CPR and, most importantly, almost immediate defibrillation. And so his heart going with the reset of electricity, boom, boom, back into a normal rhythm. And he did exceptionally well. And that, he was one of the lucky 10%.
So Eriksen's playing for Denmark at the time, is playing for Manchester United, is the peak of athleticism. Is that what you talked about before in terms of genetics coming into play?
Yeah, it is. And it's a really important point as well, because when we think of heart disease, we think of life being at ads and Norm sitting on the couch and having a beer and all of those things. Whereas cardiac arrest, particularly in the middle-aged and young, has very little to do with risk factors. So forget about, being a bit overweight or eating the wrong things or all those things that we associate with heart disease. For cardiac arrest, it's more about genetics, predisposition, to some degree, a lot of bad luck, if you like, or at least maybe that's the wrong thing to say, because what we call bad luck today is something that we understand better tomorrow. But certainly the risk factors that we think about for heart disease do not apply in this group. And another really important thing is that when we speak to politicians and things, they say, but we've got heart disease solved, because the reduction in death due to cardiovascular causes has fallen more than 40% over the last 30 years due to treatment of things like heart attacks in older people, things like statin medications for cholesterol, stopping cigarette smoke, all of those things which have saved countless lives in 70-year-olds. Whereas if you look at the statistics of people, particularly under the age of 40, over the last 40 years, there's a straight line. There's been no improvement, and we have not made really any impact on cardiac arrest and preventing sudden cardiac death. Does that mean, therefore, we're never going to, or does it mean we haven't shone the light on it? I think the very reason we're sitting here even explaining to people what the terms mean tell me that we haven't had the red hot dip that we should be on trying to prevent this.
So is the genetics play the ultimate, I know cure is not the right word, but the path to reducing these amounts of occurrences?
There's a lot of optimism in genetics. So as we start to understand the causes, particularly in younger people, genetic predisposition, so genetic causes of cardiomyopathies, of channelopathies, makes up quite a substantial number. So when someone dies of a cardiac arrest, in a reasonable proportion, we will find a genetic cause underpinning that. And then we can trace that through the family and put in preventive strategies. So at the moment, genetics are critical in us being able to look after and save relatives of people who have had a cardiac arrest. What the challenge of the future is how do we identify before, it's not good enough that someone has to die to save other family members. We need to come up with a strategy where we identify the person who is at risk before they die.
So if I said to you, can you check my genetics? You couldn't do that unless you had someone in my family that had passed away from a cardiac arrest.
We could check your genetics. We can screen the population for genetic causes. It's not a good idea. And the reason for that gets a bit complicated, but for a start, the yield is low. So these genetic conditions, for example, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is one of the most common. It's around 1 in 500, 1 in 200 people. But even if so there's the issue of identifying what we call pathological variant, or if you like, a mutation in the genes that is associated with one of these heart conditions. The problem with genetics is we think about it as, we found a mutation, or your genes are normal. That's not how genetics works, and there's a whole lot of variants in our genome where we're not sure what it means. So if I was to do your genetics, there would be some variant in one of your genes, even if it's not related to the heart, where we'd say, I don't know what that means. Maybe you're going to get dementia, or maybe you're going to, you could have a risk for cancer, and we'll look into it. Basically, it opens Pandora's box if we were to do genetic screening on everyone. However, we are getting better, and we are getting sort of more targeted in what we look for. So broad-based, and also there's the expense, because at the moment broad-based genetic screening would be at least, be somewhere north of $1,000 per individual, and no politician's going to take that on. But in the future, I think both with us understanding genetics, targeting it better, and with the technologies becoming cheaper, I don't think that's out of the question. We do it for some conditions at birth. They take little pricks and make sure that you don't have a small number of conditions. Those do not include the conditions we're talking about for the heart, but it may be in the future that it does. The second issue is that if you have, let's say we do your genetics and we find that you have a gene for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, there's a real variation in, if everyone has the same genetic mutation, only some of those people will express the disease, and some of them it'll be severe and some will be mild. So just knowing that you have the genetic mutation doesn't tell us everything about whether it's going to be sort of expressed. That concept is called penetrance, whether the gene comes through. We don't understand that all that well at the moment. So a very long-winded way of saying genetics, I think, does hold the key to a lot of these things, but at the moment we don't. It's a little bit of a coarse tool on a population level, a very useful tool when we're looking at a family where we've got a high suspicion that that's what's going on.
In terms of if you've had a cardiac arrest in your family,
if someone in your family has had a cardiac arrest, particularly if they're middle-aged or young, but even in general, you should be seeing someone who knows about it, because the family should be investigated. There is now there's recommendations around the world that the family members should be investigated, and very clear ways in which we do that, looking for heart causes. So we would generally do things like a 12-lead ECG, very cheap and easy test. We would do an ultrasound of the heart. We would do an exercise test. And depending on what we found on those things, we might be doing further tests still. And we would be considering, if not recommending, genetic testing to see if we can identify in that family a cause that can lead to preventive treatments.
and is this seeing a cardiologist or your GP, or who do you...
Very good question. And one of the things that we're looking at on an Australian-wide thing is at the moment, unfortunately, there's sort of too few centres of excellence, if you like. You know, there's a number of big hospitals in Melbourne and Sydney and in most major cities that are expert at doing this. But, you know, it's much more common than those centres of excellence. So we need some sort of system, because at the moment a lot of people are directed. So if someone dies suddenly in your family, often the forensic institutes will have the first port of call as seeing your GP. And the poor GP, they've got so many conditions and things to think about, and there's few where this is part of their sort of swinging arc, you know, something that they're comfortable or know where to refer. So we're trying to develop pathways where people can be directed, where two things can happen. One, where there's a level of local expertise, and secondly, where they can seek additional help from expert centres. And, you know, again, these are things that should be part of a good health system. And we have a good health system, but we really haven't, you know, got this right yet.
In terms of shorter term treatment, what's the current situation there?
So the treatment for a cardiac arrest is defibrillation, is getting electricity on the chest and resetting the heart. Easy, but easy but not easy. So what I mean by easy is that the actual instruments that we have, automated external defibrillators that hang on the wall at your supermarket, etc., they're really easy to use. They tell you what to do. You put them on the chest and it'll tell you when to go. And we need to remove all the barriers to getting there. The reason I say not so easy is there's so many hurdles before we get to that. And the very first one is people feeling comfortable and understanding what's going on. And when someone has a cardiac arrest, if someone is not responsive, there's a big push to make things simpler and just assume that is a cardiac arrest. Because at the moment, people, you know, the Dr. ABC, I won't go through everything, but there's, you know, you need to make sure that the airway's clear, see if they're breathing, seeing if they're responsive. Things like breathing. When someone has a cardiac arrest, there's often what are called agonal movements, or it looks like the person is breathing. And it's thought to be due to sort of brain activity when there's not enough blood flow. But people can confuse some of those chest movements as it looks like they're breathing and therefore think that they're not having a cardiac arrest. People can have epilepsy-like movements. They can have little seizures, again, because the brain's not getting the oxygen it needs. People should not be thinking that's epilepsy. So there's a big movement. If a person collapses and they're not responsive, assume it's a cardiac arrest, and then you need to do two things. You need to start CPR, and CPR is simply a bridge to defibrillation. CPR doesn't save lives on its own. It really saves lives in that it provides some blood flow until the heart is restarted. So when someone is not responsive and collapsed to the ground, the first thing in the mind should be, I need to get defibrillation to this person's chest, and I need there to be some degree of blood flow until that happens.
And then obviously the second part to that is you need the equipment, you need the tool.
You do. And there's a lot of campaigns going on to make defibrillators easier, more identifiable, more accessible, and then you need someone who feels comfortable and has the skills to use one. And education of kids, I think it'd be interesting, probably a lot of our school kids would feel more comfortable doing this than a lot of the adults. And there, again, a big push that it should be part of school education. You know, that every child should graduate from school knowing how to do CPR and how to use a defibrillator, because it is absolutely a life-saving skill, and defibrillators are going to become more and more common. They're cheap, they're more accessible. There's now a number of companies that make devices that are not much bigger than an iPhone that you can carry around in your pocket or in the glove box of your car. So there's even some that use the battery of your iPhone and connect it up. So there's a number of strategies that will become better and better and cheaper, and it won't be long before we all walk around with a defibrillator if we know how to use it. And that'll be a good day. It won't be the solution because unfortunately a large percentage of cardiac arrests occur unwitnessed when people are at home asleep, or when people are walking in the park by themselves, or whatever. So that is, the defibrillator initiative, getting more out into the community, and getting more people to understand how to use them is an absolutely huge priority, maybe the number one priority for cardiac arrest today, but it's not the solution or the complete solution for tomorrow. The best defibrillator would be one that we don't have to use because we don't need to use it. But that day is going to be some way off.
Interesting point before you said about people can have a cardiac arrest when they're asleep, when they're riding Paris-Roubaix, when they're playing the Euros Football League. Does it change in frequency? Across those kind of different levels of exercise. Yeah,
so the most common situation in which someone has a cardiac arrest is during their sleep. But that is because we spend 1/3 of our day asleep. So it just is a sort of percentage exposure, if you like. Exercise, on the other hand, comes out as just one of the situations, but if you then do it per exposure time, it's a big risk. So it's very clear that exercise is a trigger of cardiac arrest. It is a time when you're most likely to have a cardiac arrest, and particularly with those underlying conditions that I discussed earlier. It gets even slightly more complicated than that, because there's a thing called the exercise paradox, where, for example, if you don't regularly exercise and you get up from the couch and run to the fridge, then your risk of having a cardiac arrest versus if you stayed on the couch is 70 times higher. So you get up and you run, and your risk has just gone up 70 times. Now, if you regularly run, if you're fit, then that risk comes down to less than 7 times. So you basically have to stay fit to prevent yourself from exercise being a big risk, We call that the exercise paradox. So, but it does explain why fit people, that overall fit people have a risk of cardiac arrest that is similar or lower. Because even though they're exercising a lot, each exercise bout is less of a problem than the person who's unfit. Now, having said all of that, if people are still following, what people do need to be left with is whether you're fit or not. If you're fitter, it's less of a risk, but whether you're fit or not, exercise is a risk time. And so people do need to be aware of that, and it is also why things like sporting clubs are very sensible places to have defibrillators, because it is, it clearly is associated with heightened risk. Why is that? When you exercise, the whole system is put under more stress. The heart has to work harder. It needs more oxygen, and also it's a time when there's a lot of adrenaline in the system, and a number of things like adrenaline and some of the hormones during exercise are additional triggers or little things that can make the heart more easily go into these chaotic rhythms.
I'm not sure if you could know this, but does it change depending on what type of exercise? More thinking around high intensity versus longer form endurance work.
It does. So I don't completely know the answer to that, but it does seem that there is a tendency for it to be in situations particularly associated with adrenaline. So short, sharp bursts of exercise. You can imagine being on the field in front of 100,000 spectators is another heightened risk. And those sort of things tend to be more of a risk than sort of your more regular jog. And we use that principle as one of the ways of addressing the exercise paradox, is that we tell people when they get into exercise to sort of treat it with respect and build it up gradually, both in intensity and duration, with the idea that the higher intensity exercise represents a higher risk.
Yep.
The other...
Do you want to just net that out with the benefits of like everything else that comes with it?
Yeah, I think it's really important, because the cardiac arrest there's a big debate as to whether cardiac arrest is more common in athletes. There's some data in Italy that cardiac arrest is more common in athletes. There's data from Denmark that it's far less common in athletes. I think that when you look at all the data across the world, it's quite hard to know. What I would quite confidently conclude, and is an important point for people listening, is that athletes are not protected from cardiac arrest. The rates are probably similar overall to other people, and I think that is a combination of exercise being less of a risk but being done more often by athletes, and overall those two things net out to be so that it's similar to other people. And that is balanced against, because we've got to remember that even though this whole thing we're talking about cardiac arrest, 99.9%, we actually haven't talked about that, and maybe I'll bring it up now, but for example, a 30-year-old male, the risk of dying suddenly is about 1 in 50,000, 1 in 20, 1 in 50,000. So that leaves 99.99 something percent of people not having a cardiac arrest. And for that 99.999, they get enormous benefits from exercise. The risks of cardiac arrest, or the prevention of cardiac arrest, is not something that I put in the good column of being an athlete. I think it's much the same. Some evidence that it might be slightly higher, but I'm not worried about. To me, absolutely the benefits of sport in terms of daily function, in terms of, in fact, preventing heart attacks later in life, preventing stroke, preventing diabetes, all of those things massively outweighs any tiny risk of cardiac arrest. But when we're talking about this young population, it does become a very important thing, because every life's a tragedy, and we need to tie sport and exercise in there because it is a high-risk time, and it's something we've got to look at. The other thing that I wanted, because I've just pointed out there, 1 in 20, 1 in 50,000 sort of 30-year-old males. The reason I said males is that for reasons we don't completely understand, men are around about 5 times more likely than women. Probably something to do with women's hearts being electrically more stable. Some people might argue women are just more stable in general, but let's stick to the heart. But there is, because women are less likely to have a number of heart rhythm problems. Atrial fibrillation, one of the most common safe heart rhythm problems, more common in males. It may be something related to that. People wonder about hormones because that's one of the other differences. We don't really understand the gender difference, but it comes up every single time it's studied. So it's more common in men, yet, as I said at the beginning, even despite that, it's up there as number one or amongst the top causes of death in women as well.
In the athlete space, obviously it's their full-time job, or on the way to being their full-time job. It's about pushing boundaries. It's about 1%ers. It's about training that little bit harder, go be a little bit harder here, another session here, another whatever it is, interval, extend the interval, go harder through this block. Does that play into things, considering you're probably going to be operating, like you said, more time, but also at a higher level in terms of heart rate, in terms of how hard you're going?
Yeah, so it's a really important point, and it comes back to the sad case of Edward, and it was raised with the rowing and the very hard training that's done there. Is, did he train so hard that caused the cardiac arrest? And I can be black and white on this. Exercise did not cause his cardiac arrest. You cannot exercise so hard that that your heart goes into an arrest. It sort of has come into a bit the common vernacular. The training was killing me, and these sort of terms, or he's gonna kill those kids. They're going that hard. This sort of concept that you go really, really hard, and then at some point the engine blows, is not science. It is not, and we have millions and millions of data points. People have exercised to maximum throughout the history of time and on a massive level, and we don't see that. We've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of tests where scientists like myself have supervised people exercising to the maximum, and you don't exercise up to a point where it gets so hard that your heart's unstable. That is not something that we consider amongst the causes of cardiac arrest. We don't sort of say, what's the cause here? He exercised too hard. That's not on the list. So people shouldn't be concerned about that. If you exercise really hard across decades or across your lifetime, can that cause, a cardiac arrest? Can that cause heart injury that can put people at risk? And that's a big question, and it's probably not one to go into at length in this podcast, because it's probably the sort of simple answer on a public health level would be to say no. But there is actually a bit of sort of scientific research, including some of our own, looking at whether some of the little bits of injury from really high exercise can accumulate over time, cause a little bit of scar in the heart muscle that, like a genetic condition, could cause serious heart rhythm problems. But that in general is not what we're talking about here. It is something that comes up in the 35-year-old Tour de France cyclist who's done 20 Tour de France's, and you wonder about the cumulative effect of long-term exercise. But even again, the thing to really stress is that in that situation, it's surely that combined with other things, because it's still a rare event in those people. But it does seem that some of these things, like perhaps something underlying genetics combined with lots and lots of bouts of high-intensity exercise, might put some people a little bit more at risk than the average person.
In terms of what you're working on, in terms of what the world is working on, your peers in this space, what's kind of the next point? What's next for the research in terms of sudden cardiac death and cardiac arrest?
So there's a number of strategies going on in Australia. I'm involved with a group that I'm proudly involved with called AUSCAR, which is the Australian Cardiac Arrest Alliance. And one of the things that group is trying to do is to take a sort of a whole of problem approach. So we have this diagram that we often refer to called the circle of hope that goes every bit from sort of basic science and molecular science through to resuscitation, education, CPR, defibrillators like we spoke about, creating registries so that we understand the statistics, involving people with lived experience, really every part you can think of, and bringing everyone together. Because I think that is also a key element, that we often have the people who advocate for defibrillators sort of almost competing against the basic scientists who say the defibrillators don't fix the problem and the defibrillator, well, you're not so. We really need to sort of, I think, do the best we can in every area for such a big problem. And so that's one big principle. The aim of everything is to identify people at risk and prevent people from having a cardiac arrest. There's been different strategies taken around the world, some of them successful, some of them I would say a little bit reactive. One which is worthy of discussion is, what can you and I do, what can our children do to see if they're at risk of having a cardiac arrest? And there's a number of strategies around the world using ECG screening, relatively cheap tests to have a look at the electrical signature of your heart and see if that identifies a heart problem that could put you at risk of having a cardiac arrest. And it's a controversial practice that is recommended by some sporting bodies, not by others, by some countries, not by others, by the IOC, for example, but not by other sporting bodies. The fact that there's not been uniformity tells you something about it already, because the science is inconclusive. There's one big study in Italy where it seemed that when they started screening, at the start of the 1980s through to now, there's been quite a considerable drop in the number of cardiac arrests, but the rate that they've got to at the end of that is very similar to the worldwide experience. So other people would say that is what we call regression to the mean. What I mean by that is, for example, after this death last week in Melbourne, people will be saying, why aren't we screening? And we may institute a screening program, particularly if there was a little cluster, if for whatever reason, usually randomness, but if there were 2 or 3 people in the next few months where this happened, I think you could bet your bottom dollar that someone will say, we have to start screening. And then we would have no cases for the next 10 years and we'd say screening worked. But it's not necessarily anything to do with the screening, it's the randomness of statistics. And so a lot of people would argue that shouldn't be used as proof. A lot of this is very complicated, but again, if we sort of circle back each time to where are we at, there's people who advocate very strongly for screening, people who argue strongly against it. What I think you can say quite clearly is that it's not absolutely proven. If someone came to me and said, I want my kids to be screened, I would be very happy to do it if they understood that it was not a fail-safe thing by any means. Ericsson had been screened many times and he had a cardiac arrest. Most of the people we know of in cycling and various sports where there's screening every year, where people have the tests and there's still cardiac arrest happening, it is not foolproof by any means. It is not a guarantee. And there's also side effects, because people have an ECG and we pick things up which aren't going to cause them to have a cardiac arrest, but we're not sure, and it leads to tests, it leads to disqualifications, it leads to things. So it's not perfect. It is a strategy, and one that has improved. So, this is what I mean a bit about the whole of the purpose. Because I think cardiac arrest is so devastating. It has such an impact on society. It absolutely rips families apart. We need to focus on this with a laser-like attention and not dismiss any part of it. But at the same time, when people come and say, well, we should just be screening, they've missed the point, because there is today not any one thing. There's not one solution to this complex problem.
We might wrap up on that point. Thanks, André.
Thanks, Alex.